"Enough, Susan," my mother snapped, her voice trembling with frustration as she leaned forward, eyes locked on me across the table. The Christmas tree lights twinkled softly, casting a warm glow in the room, but the festive atmosphere felt hollow, a stark contrast to the tension we were all sitting in. I froze, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying to keep my anger under control. My dad added to the fire, his voice just as cutting. "You've always found a way to make everything about you." His words hit harder than I expected, and for a moment, the only sound that filled the air was the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. My name is Susan Blanchard, and at that time, I was 32 years old. This all took place in the late 1970s, a period when families, especially in rural Illinois, depended on one another. Our family farm, passed down through generations, was the heart of our lives, though it was struggling. I had moved to Chicago years earlier, pursued a career in law, a decision my parents viewed as a rebellion against everything they held dear. My older brother Jake had stayed behind, running the farm and basking in the unending praise from our parents. I didn't resent his choice to stay. What bothered me was that no matter how hard I tried, I was always the outsider. Since the summer, I had been quietly transferring money to the farm's shared account to help with the mounting bills Jake had told me about. He asked me not to tell our parents, claiming it would hurt their pride and make them feel as if they'd failed. At the time, his reasoning seemed reasonable. I didn't want to shame them, and I trusted Jake to manage things. But now, on Christmas Eve, listening to my parents praise Jake for his efforts to keep the farm afloat, I felt betrayed. In that moment, it dawned on me that he had been taking credit for every penny I had sent. "Jake's the reason the farm is still standing," my mother said proudly. "I don't know what we'd do without him." I glanced over at Jake, hoping to see a hint of guilt or recognition in his eyes, but instead, he simply smirked, leaning back in his chair as if enjoying the scene. That was when I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Actually," I interjected, my voice shaking but loud enough to silence the conversation, "I've been the one sending the money. Every month since July." My dad scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just said something absurd. "Don't start making things up, Susan. Jake's been here every day, working tirelessly for this family. Why would you even say such a thing?" His words stung, but the dismissive tone cut deeper. My mom folded her arms and chimed in, "You've always had a way of making everything about you. Honestly, Susan, it's Christmas. Can we not ruin the night with this nonsense?" Heat rushed to my face, a mix of anger and humiliation washing over me. "I'm not making it up," I said, my voice growing more assertive. "I've been depositing money at the Chicago branch of the bank, directly into the farm's account. Every single deposit has come from me." But they weren't even paying attention. My dad waved me off, frustration evident on his face, while my mom turned her attention to Jake, who just shrugged as if he had no idea what I was talking about. The situation was unbearable. I realized then that there was no point in trying to convince them. They had already made their minds up. I turned sharply to Jake. "Are you really going to sit there and lie about it, Jake? You know I've been making those deposits at the Chicago branch all these months." Jake didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, the smirk never leaving his face. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Susan," he said, feigning innocence. My blood boiled. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. But our parents didn't seem to care. My dad let out a heavy sigh, as if I were the one ruining the evening, and my mom looked at Jake with sympathy, as though he were the victim of some ridiculous accusation. I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor, and confronted Jake directly. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "Those deposits weren't small, Jake. You've been sitting here, letting Mom and Dad believe you're the hero when all you've done is lie. If you don't admit it now, I'll leave first thing tomorrow, head back to Chicago, and get the proof myself." Jake just shrugged, reclining as if this was some trivial matter. "You're wasting your time, Susan," he chuckled. "Whatever story you've made up in your head, go ahead and prove it." "I don't care." In that moment, it became clear to me, Jake didn't believe I would actually go through with it. To him, this was just another one of those family arguments that would fade away. He thought I'd back down, too afraid of the fallout to follow through. His smirk confirmed it. It became painfully clear to me in that instant that Jake didn't think I would follow through. To him, this was just another family dispute that would blow over, where I'd eventually give in as I always had before, letting him win. The smirk on his face said everything. He believed I wouldn't dare take action. That only made my resolve stronger. I wasn't going to allow him to get away with it any longer. Not this time. He had taken advantage of me, lied to our parents, and basked in their praise while treating my contributions like they meant nothing. No, I was headed to Chicago, and I was going to make sure the truth was known. The next morning, I packed my things, unable to stay in that house for another second. I told our parents I was leaving, and, as expected, my mom sighed heavily, her disapproval clear in her tone. "It's Christmas, Susan," she said, as if I were the one ruining everything. My dad didn't even lift his eyes from his coffee. "Can't go a single holiday without causing a scene," he muttered under his breath. Jake barely suppressed a smug grin, reclining comfortably in his chair like he had won. But I wasn't going to stay, especially not with everyone treating me like I was the problem. I knew the banks would be closed, but that didn't matter to me. I just needed to escape, to get away from their judgment and Jake's lies. The drive to Chicago felt endless. The streets were eerily quiet, most people tucked away, celebrating with their families. I gripped the wheel tightly, the cold winter air creeping into the car despite the heater blasting. My mind replayed everything that had happened the night before. Jake truly didn't believe I'd go through with it. That much was clear. He probably thought I'd just stew in silence, too intimidated by our parents' blind faith in him to take action. But not this time. I was exhausted from being dismissed and from letting him walk all over me. As I drove past snow-covered fields and frozen lakes, one thing was clear: I was going to get those receipts, and I was going to make sure the truth came to light. When the banks opened a few days later, I headed straight to the Chicago branch. It was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made every breath feel like ice. As soon as I walked in, I approached the counter. A middle-aged teller greeted me with a friendly smile. "Good morning," he said. "How can I help you today?" I explained, speaking carefully but firmly, that I needed copies of every deposit I had made to the Blanchard Farm account since July. The teller nodded and went into the back. A moment later, he returned with a thick ledger and a small machine that printed receipts. He began feeding the records into the machine, which hummed as it printed out each transaction. I watched with focus as each receipt came out, one after another, each clearly showing my name, the dates, and the amounts. He handed me the stack with a polite, "Here you go, ma'am. Let us know if there's anything else you need." I thanked him, my hands trembling slightly as I held the receipts. They were more than just paper, they were evidence. Evidence that Jake had been lying, and proof that I wouldn't just let this slip by unnoticed. With the receipts in hand, I walked straight back to my car. The roads were slick from an earlier snowstorm, but I didn't care. I was determined to get home and wasn't going to waste another minute. The receipts sat on the passenger seat beside me, neatly stacked and weighed down by a small paperweight I had grabbed from my desk. Every time I glanced at them, my anger flared up once again. I couldn't believe Jake thought he could get away with it, and worse, that our parents had so easily sided with him. The drive back felt longer, the farm seeming farther away with each mile. As I passed quiet towns and frozen fields, my mind raced, replaying every moment from Christmas Eve, every dismissive glance, every smug grin from Jake. By the time I turned onto the long driveway leading up to the farmhouse, I was practically shaking with adrenaline. I had no idea how this would unfold, but one thing was for sure: I wasn't leaving until the truth was in front of their eyes. I entered the house, the receipts tightly gripped in my hand, the cold air still lingering on my coat. My mom was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove while my dad sat at the dining table, reading the newspaper. Jake leaned against the counter, casually eating an apple, still wearing that smug expression. They all looked up as I walked in, but before anyone could say anything, I dropped the stack of receipts onto the table in front of my dad. "There," I said, my voice steady but resolute. "Every deposit I've made to the farm account since July. It's all right there. my name, the dates, the amounts. My dad put down his paper, frowning as he picked up the receipts and started flipping through them. My mom walked over, drying her hands on a dish towel, her face initially full of skepticism. Jake didn't budge from his spot, but I saw his smirk falter for just a moment. This can't be right, my dad muttered, scanning the pages. Why would you do this, Susan? My mother's eyes narrowed as she leaned in closer, trying to verify what she was hearing. Jake said he's been handling everything, she muttered, her voice a strange mix of disbelief and confusion. I turned to face Jake directly, meeting his gaze with a firm resolve. Well, Jake? I asked, my voice cutting through the air. Are you still going to deny it now? Jake responded with a laugh, casually tossing the core of his apple into the trash as if the situation held no importance. Susan, I don't know where you got these, but they're not real. You must have forged them to make me look bad, he said in a tone that was unnervingly calm and almost mocking. It made my stomach churn with frustration. I looked at our parents, hoping to see at least a hint of doubt in their eyes, but there was nothing. Instead, my dad shook his head, his expression clouded with disapproval. Susan, what's going on with you? He asked, his voice low and tinged with anger. This is the lowest I've seen you sink. My mom grabbed the receipts from the table, holding them up as if they were contaminated. Did you really think we wouldn't see through this? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake has been here every single day, working hard to keep this farm alive. And you? She shoved the stack of papers toward me. You come in here with these fake documents and expect us to believe them? You've always craved attention. I felt a tightness in my chest, struggling to keep my tears at bay. They're not fake, I said, my voice shaky. If you don't believe me, you can call the bank yourself. But they didn't listen. They stood there, side by side, defending Jake as if they had never doubted him, leaving me feeling like a complete outsider in my own family. I stood frozen as my dad tossed the receipts onto the table dismissively. I can't believe this, I said, my voice rising with the weight of their disbelief pressing down on me. Even with the proof right in front of you, in black and white, you still defend him? This is unbelievable. I've spent months trying to keep this farm afloat, and all you've done is credit Jake and call me a liar. Jake crossed his arms and leaned against the counter with a smug expression that made my blood boil. Don't be so dramatic, Susan, he said with a shrug, as if none of this mattered. You've always been jealous. This isn't anything new. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. You know what? I'm done, I snapped. Don't expect me to come back here. I've had enough. My mom's face stiffened, and my dad just shook his head in disappointment, as though I was the one in the wrong. Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The cold air hit me like a slap, but it felt better than staying in that house for another second. By the time I arrived back in Chicago, my mind was made up. I was done. I wasn't going to keep bending over backwards for people who refused to see the truth when it was right in front of them. The first thing I did after unpacking was call the bank and halt the deposits. No more transfers to that account, I told the teller, my voice firm despite the anger still simmering inside me. It felt strange at first, almost like I was cutting a cord that had been tying me to the farm for months. But in a way, it also felt freeing, like I was finally done carrying a weight that was never truly mine to bear. At first, I thought I would feel guilty, but I didn't. Every time I thought about Jake's arrogant expression and our parents' refusal to believe me, my resolve only grew stronger. Let Jake handle it now. Let him play the role of the hero he always wanted to be. I wasn't going to keep throwing money at a farm that treated me like an outsider. If they wanted to keep believing his lies, then they would face the consequences when the bills started piling up. And they would, because Jake didn't have a penny to his name. 6 months passed without a single word from my family, no phone calls, no letters. Nothing. I occasionally thought about them, but every time I did, the anger and hurt resurfaced, so I pushed those feelings aside and focused on my work. Then, one afternoon in the middle of summer, there was a knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, I froze. There stood my mom and dad, looking worn out and a bit uneasy. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. "Can we come in?" my dad asked, his voice softer than usual. My mom stood beside him, clutching her purse with both hands, her lips pressed tightly together. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, but curiosity won out. I stepped aside, allowing them into my apartment. They sat down on the couch awkwardly, glancing around as though unsure of what to do next. "What do you want?" I finally asked, leaning against the armrest of a chair, my arms crossed. I wasn't interested in small talk. Whatever they had to say, I wanted to hear it now. My dad cleared his throat, staring down at the floor as if he were searching for the right words. "Susan," he began, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "We owe you an apology. A big one." My mom nodded, holding her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "We were wrong," she said quietly. "We didn't believe you when you tried to tell us the truth." I took a deep breath. We need to fix this." I crossed my arms and leaned back in the chair, the weight of the moment settling in. "Go ahead," I said, my voice sharper than I had meant it to be. My dad let out a deep sigh, the sound of it heavy with years of unspoken regret. "After you left, everything started falling apart at the farm. Bills started piling up, equipment broke down, and we couldn't afford the repairs. The crops didn't produce enough to keep us afloat," he explained. "At first, we didn't understand what was going on. We thought Jake had it under control. He kept saying he would figure it out." He paused, his voice faltering. "But he didn't. And when we started pushing him, he finally admitted the truth." I looked over at my mom. Her eyes were filled with tears as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He told us, Susan. He admitted that you were the one who made all the deposits, that you were the reason we managed to stay afloat for so long. We couldn't believe it. Not just that he lied, but that we didn't listen when you tried to tell us." "I'm so sorry." "We're all so sorry." Her hands reached out toward me, trembling. "For not believing you. For everything we did, you didn't deserve any of it." I stared at them, watching their faces filled with sorrow. But it wasn't just regret I saw, it was something more, something unexpected, genuine shame. For the first time, I saw them in a different light. Dad looked me in the eyes. "We're asking for your forgiveness, Susan. I know we don't deserve it, but we had to come and tell you the truth. You saved the farm, and for that, we owe you more than just an apology." I let their words linger in the air for a moment, the silence wrapping itself around us. Part of me wanted to make them sit in that uncomfortable quiet, to force them to feel the weight of what they had done. But I broke the silence. "Where's Jake?" My voice was steady, but I could feel the anger rising just beneath the surface. My mom exchanged a quick glance with my dad before answering softly, "He's still at the farm. He wanted to come with us, but we thought it was better if we spoke to you alone first." Dad shifted uncomfortably, eyes glued to the floor. "He's been keeping to himself since he admitted everything. I think he knows there's no excuse for what he did. He's ashamed, Susan." "Ashamed?" I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "That's rich. Ashamed after all the months of letting you think I was a liar? After letting him take credit for everything I did to keep the farm running?" My dad lowered his gaze, his face pale with guilt. "You're right," he murmured, barely above a whisper. "We let it go on too long. It's on us as much as it is on him. But he wanted us to tell you he's sorry. He said he doesn't expect you to forgive him, but he needed us to say it." "He said what?" I snapped, leaning forward in my chair. "You're still protecting him? He should be here, apologizing to me himself. You should have made him come here." My voice echoed in the small room, and I saw the shock on their faces. But I didn't care. I was done pretending. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Do you even hear yourselves? He lies, he manipulates, and he twists everything I did into some heroic story about him. And now, when it's time to take responsibility, you're still shielding him? What? He's too embarrassed to face me, so you come here to clean up his mess?" I shook my head in disbelief. "Do you even understand how crazy that sounds?" Dad shifted uneasily, his hands gripping his knees. "We thought it would be easier for everyone," he muttered. "Easier for who?" I shot back. "For Jake? For you? Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me." Neither of them spoke after that. My mom stared down at her hands, nervously twisting the strap of her purse, while my dad kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tight. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy, until finally, Dad stood up. "You're right," he said quietly, not looking at me. "We should have brought him. We should have made him face you. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe because we've been making excuses for him for so long, it just became second nature." Mom followed suit, standing up and clutching her purse to her chest. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes, but there was no defense left in her. "We're sorry, Susan," she whispered. "You deserved better from all of us." Without waiting for a response, they walked toward the door. Dad opened it, glancing back at me for a fleeting moment, his face full of regret. Then they left, the door clicking shut behind them. I sat there for what felt like forever, the weight of their shame pressing down on me. They knew I was right, and for the first time, it felt like they truly saw it. A week later, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened it, a wave of unease washed over me. Jake stood there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, looking more miserable than I had ever seen him. "Susan," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can I come in?" For a moment, I thought about slamming the door in his face, but instead, I stepped aside without saying a word, letting him in. He stood uncomfortably in the center of my living room, avoiding sitting down or even removing his jacket, shifting his weight back and forth between his feet. Finally, he spoke. I came to apologize," he said, his eyes quickly flickering around the room as if he couldn't bring himself to meet my gaze. "For everything. For lying, for taking credit for the money you sent, for letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did." His voice wavered, and I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "I don't have an excuse. I was jealous of you, Susan. I always have been. You've done so much with your life, and I've just stayed behind. I thought if I could keep their approval, it would make me feel, I don't know, important, I guess. But I was wrong. All of it." His voice cracked completely, and before I could respond, he buried his face in his hands and started crying. The sobs were deep and uncontrollable, shaking his entire body. It wasn't the kind of crying someone pretends to do. It was raw, full of guilt, and for the first time, I saw just how much he was suffering. He didn't try to hide it, and for a moment, I simply stood there, unsure of what to say or how to act. After that conversation, things started to change. My parents didn't reach out right away, but when they did, their tone was different. There were no more defensiveness or excuses, no attempt to downplay Jake's behavior. It was as if they had finally stopped protecting him. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell they were treating him differently. My dad casually mentioned that they had begun handling the farm's finances themselves, and my mom let slip that Jake was trying to make things right. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. As for Jake, after that apology, he gave me space. He didn't try to fix things too quickly, which I appreciated. Trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight, but just knowing that my parents had finally acknowledged his actions and the hurt they had caused me brought me a sense of peace. From that point on, even though things were never perfect in my family, they started to feel more balanced and fair. Subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. Don't forget to click so you won't miss more great stories we share here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.